Welcome to Longyear Museum. In this short film, we'd like to introduce you to the woman this museum is about, the discoverer, founder, and leader of Christian Science.
The days of sail made the kind of men who would trust their souls to providence and hold the wheel steady against the storm. Like them, their wives were the kind who could face into the gales of life and keep faith with God. One such woman was Mrs. Christiana Godfrey of Chelsea, Massachusetts, daughter of sailors, sister and cousin to sailors, wife of a sailor. Christiana and her husband had lost 2 young sons to illness, leaving them with one precious 7-year-old daughter. All her few years, their Mary had suffered bouts of what was called in those days membranous croup. That winter brought on an attack so severe, the Godfreys worried for their little girl's life. As a northeast snowstorm raged outside and Mary's fever raged inside, her mother knew what she had to do. She must go for aid to her remarkable new friend, a woman who lived a few towns up the Atlantic coast in Lynn, a woman who healed by prayer.
Aunt Nancy kept telling Mother that she was crazy to take me on such a journey a day like that, and I would surely die. Mary Godfrey Parker.
Christiana was undeterred. This daughter of seafarers bundled her ailing child in a blanket, and together they marched out into the winter storm toward the train to Lynn. At Lynn, mother and child made their way from the station to a house a few blocks away on Broad Street.
The landlady of the house, her mother's new friend, met them at the door, saw at a glance what was needed, calmly told little Mary she would be all right, and sent her upstairs to play.
I did as she told me, ran upstairs, and immediately I was all right. That was the end of this awful condition. Mary Godfrey Parker.
That was as her mother knew it would be. It was not the first time Christiana Godfrey had found healing here. Her own badly infected finger had been healed. Friends she had sent here had been healed. In her eyes, this friend in Lynn was the most wonderful woman that ever was.
That woman, Mary Baker Glover as she was known then, Mary Baker Eddy as we know her today, had come to this place in Lynn braving a lifetime of storms of a different kind.
She was born Mary Morse Baker in 1821 on a farm in the hills of Bow, New Hampshire, youngest of the Baker children, growing up surrounded by a plain farming life, chores, family pleasures, schooling, church, and prayer.
Even in her earliest years, there were storms, the waves of illness that often kept her from normal activity, the theological storm of confrontation with stern articles of faith fervently held by her father, particularly the doctrine that only God's chosen few would enter paradise, all others lost to perdition.
Then God is not as good as my mother, she told her mother, and he will find me a hard case.
Her beloved brothers and sisters perhaps damned forever? No. What kind of God was that? At 22, Mary Baker became Mrs. George Washington Glover, and the couple set sail for his home in the South. A storm off the Carolinas threatened shipwreck. The newlyweds bowed together in prayer in their cabin, coming through the tempest to land at Charleston with bright hopes. 6 months later, the hopes devastated, her husband dead of yellow fever, Mary returned home, a young widow with no means of her own, and expecting a child. A difficult birth after a childhood of constant illness left her often bedridden. After a few years, the young single mother was forced to let her family send her very active Georgie away for neighbors to raise, virtually, a foster child. In time, the foster family moved to the Midwest, taking with them, without her permission, her now 11-year-old boy. Mother and son were lost to each other for many years. By that time, she had remarried. Daniel Patterson, an engaging but faithless man, had promised to make a home for her son, a promise which he broke, the first of many. Now in her 30s, she found herself isolated in the New Hampshire hills, health failing, husband's livelihood failing, the marriage failing. Daniel occasionally becoming involved with other women. Eventually, he would abandon his wife, leading after some further years to her being granted a divorce based on his desertion and infidelity. Meanwhile, she was sinking deeper into invalidism.
And, she said, drifting whither I knew not. The question persisted. Where was God in all this? What kind of God? Through these turbulent waters, she held steady to her Bible, loved and learned by heart since childhood, including God's promise, "Unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings."
Moving from place to place during those trying years, she explored mental causes for bodily ills and discovered hints that disease might not be the result of physical law or divine punishment, but human error. In 1866, living in an apartment in Swampscott, Massachusetts, on the outskirts of Lynn, her life was moving toward a great turning point.
On a wintry Thursday evening in February, she took a bad fall. For 2 days, she lay helplessly in bed, unable to stand, tended to by worried friends. A respected doctor offered little hope for her recovery. On Sunday, turning to gospel accounts of Jesus healing the sick, she experienced a burst of inspiration and announced to her anxious caregivers that she would get to her feet and walk. Those who saw her do it were amazed. She told them, "This is all through prayer."
After years of suffering, searching, questioning, praying, this experience marked a new beginning. All her 45 years had been preamble to this moment. In the 45 years that followed occurred all that she is remembered for. Her discovery of what she would name Christian Science came gradually. Months passed as she continued to search the scriptures for the principle and the science behind her healing, and demonstrated what she was discovering by healing others.
She would later write of these days in and around Lynn, "Once that city resounded with my cures." In the teachings and example of Christ Jesus, and in the solid evidence of healings through prayer alone, she was finding an assurance of God's presence that was helping her surmount the stormy tides. She would write, "And o'er earth's troubled, angry sea, I see Christ walk and come to me and tenderly, divinely talk."
Healing others led to teaching others to heal by the same principle. In 1872, she felt impelled to begin writing a book to present her teaching more widely. With no place to call home, she moved from place to place as she wrote and rewrote. Publishers rejected her drafts, but she wrote on. At last, in a home she purchased at 8 Broad Street, Lynn, in the solitude of her attic study, she wrote the final pages. The product of her 4 years of labor appeared in print in 1875, Science and Health. During this time, she was known once again as Mary B. Glover, having divorced the long-absent Daniel Patterson. For 10 years now, she had been going it alone. In 1876, that would change, thanks to the seaman's wife, Christiana Godfrey. In the Godfrey's household of hardy seafarers was a frequent visitor, Asa Gilbert Eddy, so ill he often could not ply his trade. Mrs. Godfrey sent this genial, gentle man to her new friend in Lynn for healing. Within days, Gilbert was well. He promptly took Mrs. Glover's class, gave up his career, moved to Lynn, and opened an office as a practitioner of Christian Science healing. Here was someone Mary Glover could count on, at a time when few would stand with her. At the end of the year, Gilbert proposed marriage. After a night of prayer, she accepted. The next day, New Year's Day, 1877, Unitarian minister Reverend Samuel Stewart united the couple, and Mary B. Glover became Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy. With Gilbert at her side, the next 5 years saw the formation of her Christian Scientist Association, the chartering of her church, and her Massachusetts Metaphysical College, and the start of her preaching in Boston, commuting there each Sunday. In her healing practice and in her preaching, teaching, and writing, she confronted the question she encountered as a child: what kind of God? Answers to that question came to her thought through prayer and breathed through the pages of her textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. In time, the work publishers had rejected would be among the most widely read books ever written. Stormy winds continued to blow. In 1881, half of her small association and church revolted, leaving her with barely a handful of followers, as she and Gilbert prepared to move to the wider world of Boston. Then, just months after the move to Boston, Gilbert died. Bereaved and heartbroken, she repaired to a cottage in Vermont where she slowly regathered her strength of purpose.
Later she would write, "The wintry blasts of earth may uproot the flowers of affection and scatter them to the winds. But this severance of fleshly ties serves to unite thought more closely to God. For love supports the struggling heart until it ceases to sigh over the world and begins to unfold its wings for heaven." Buoyed by that sense of God as love, she went forward to fulfill what she saw as her mission.
The decade of the 1880s in Boston was spent teaching class after class at the Massachusetts Metaphysical College, preaching, lecturing, writing, and founding the Christian Science Journal. In the 1890s, retiring from Boston to the country home she called Pleasant View in Concord, New Hampshire, she reorganized the First Church of Christ Scientist, wrote its manual of bylaws, and directed construction of the Mother Church in Boston. The first decade of the new century, the Christian Science Journal, Sentinel, and Herald were reporting hundreds of cases of Christian Science healing. Her students and their students were forming branch churches across the country and in other lands. At their annual gatherings in Boston, the great domed extension, added to the original Mother Church edifice, was filled with thousands of her followers. She had come from a world of rural farms and ox carts, oil lamps, and quill pens. Her last home at Chestnut Hill had telephones and typewriters, electric lights, cameras, a motor car. There were airplanes in the sky, a new world. In 1908, she inaugurated a voice to bless that world, the Christian Science Monitor. Had Mary Baker Eddy settled into a role the 19th century generally assigned to women, she might have lived out a placid, private life, unnoticed beyond one New England city. Instead, hers was the stormy public role of proclaimer of a great religious movement that made her known far and wide as the discoverer, founder, and leader of Christian Science.
Through the turbulence and triumphs, the girl from Bow had grown to find her answer to what kind of God. In healing the sick, reforming the sinner, raising the dying, all through prayer, she found God defined anew as mind, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-wise, the one cause and creator; as spirit, all substance, power, action; as soul, the infinite, self-existent I am; as principle, supreme lawmaker; as life, immortal, eternal being; as truth, absolute reality; as love, tender, ever-present good.
7 words from the Bible, from her own experience. Names for God. Strong like a father, loving like a mother. A father, mother, God. And there she found solid ground above the stormy tides.
She wrote, "Thus truth engrounds me on the rock, upon life's shore, against which the winds and waves can shock. Oh, never more."